Welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we're cutting through the noise on 5 stories the mainstream press is either burying, distorting, or refusing to connect. From Tehran's collapsing currency to Britain's colonial fingerprints in Palestine, from Sudan's weaponized rape crisis to Beijing's missile-loaded cargo ships, tonight we follow the money, the power, and the bodies.
I'm Maya Clarity. Before we begin, remember this: every story we cover tonight is a node in a larger network. Currency collapse, colonial legacy, sexual violence as warfare, supply chain weaponization, and naval deception, these aren't isolated events. They're symptoms of an international order where civilians pay the price for elite decisions. Let's start with Iran, because the rial just told us something the State Department won't.
According to Middle East Eye, citing the Iranian student news agency, Iran's rial crashed to a record 1,810,000 to the US dollar on Wednesday. Let that number sink in. A decade ago, the exchange rate was around 36,000 to the dollar. This isn't market volatility, this is the engineered strangulation of 88 million people through sanctions, and the architects in Washington know exactly what they're doing.
And here's what the Western press conveniently omits when they cite these numbers as evidence of regime failure. Sanctions don't hurt the supreme leader's inner circle, they hurt the pharmacist in Isfahan who can't import insulin, the mother in Shiraz watching her savings evaporate overnight. Studies from the Center for Economic and Policy Research have shown sanctions function as collective punishment. Under international law, that's a war crime. But we don't call it that when we do it.
Follow the money on this one. Who benefits from Iranian currency collapse? Defense contractors selling missile defense systems to the Gulf states. Israeli hawks who've been agitating for regime change since 1996's clean break memo. And critically, the dollar hegemony itself. Every time a sovereign nation's currency dies, it reinforces the petrodollar's chokehold. Iran isn't just being punished for nuclear ambitions. It's being punished for trying to trade oil in non-dollar currencies.
There's also the BRICS angle nobody's discussing. Iran formally joined BRICS in 2024, and the timing of this acute currency crisis, coming as BRICS members debate alternative payment infrastructure, is, let's say, suspicious. The Atlantic Council and similar think tanks have explicitly written about using financial pressure to deter de-dollarization. The rial isn't dying of natural causes. It's being murdered, slowly, in plain sight.
Which brings us to story 2, and Maya, this one is going to make a lot of British viewers uncomfortable. Middle East Eye published a powerful piece arguing Britain created the literal template for Israel's occupation of Palestine, and that London must finally own up to its crimes. The historical record is damning, and yet British school curricula barely mention it.
The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was the original sin. Britain promised a land it didn't own to a movement it didn't represent, ignoring the 90% Arab majority population. But the deeper crime was the Mandate period from 1920 to 1948, when Britain pioneered the architecture of occupation, collective punishment, home demolitions, administrative detention without trial, emergency regulations. Israel didn't invent these tools. Britain handed them over, fully assembled.
And here's what the BBC won't tell you. The 1945 Defense Emergency Regulations that Britain imposed on mandatory Palestine, Israel literally inherited them word for word in 1948. They're still on the books. Home demolitions in Hebron today operate under British colonial legal frameworks. When critics call Israel's policies colonial, that's not rhetoric. It's literal jurisprudential lineage.
And Britain has never paid reparations. Never apologized. Never even formally acknowledged the crimes. Compare this to the recent French acknowledgement of crimes in Algeria, partial, inadequate, but at least uttered. Westminster has issued nothing. Worse, current British policy continues to arm Israel, sell surveillance technology, and provide diplomatic cover. The crime didn't end in 1948. It metastasized.
Who benefits from this historical amnesia? The British establishment, obviously. Accountability would mean reparations, restitution, and a rewriting of national mythology. But also the broader Anglo-American intelligence apparatus. The techniques perfected in mandatory Palestine were exported globally, to Northern Ireland, to Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, to Malaya. Counterinsurgency doctrine itself is a colonial inheritance, and admitting that means admitting the entire post-9/11 framework was built on stolen ground.
Story 3, and brace yourselves. The South China Morning Post is reporting UN agencies have raised the alarm about Sudan, where rape has become a deliberate weapon of war, triggering a mental health catastrophe of historic proportions. Médecins Sans Frontières has documented at least 3,396 survivors, nearly all women, and that's just the cases that reached medical care. The actual number is likely in the tens of thousands.
The Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces have been locked in war since April 2023. Tens of thousands dead, 11 million displaced. And while Western media spent 2024 obsessing over election horse races, the largest displacement crisis on earth was unfolding in Darfur and Khartoum. Why the silence? Because Sudan's war exposes uncomfortable truths about who's actually arming this conflict.
The United Arab Emirates has been credibly accused, by UN experts, by the New York Times, by Sudanese officials, of arming the RSF, the very force responsible for most of the documented sexual violence. The UAE, of course, is a key Western ally, host to U.S. military bases, purchaser of F-35s, signatory of the Abraham Accords. So when we ask why this story doesn't lead the news, the answer is geopolitical. Calling out the perpetrators means calling out our partners.
And the RSF didn't emerge from nowhere. They evolved from the Janjaweed militias that conducted the Darfur genocide 20 years ago. The international community vowed never again. Then we let them rebrand, rearm, and integrate into Sudan's official security architecture under General Hemeti, who became one of the richest men in Africa through gold smuggling networks that, surprise, connect to Dubai.
The mental health crisis the UN is describing isn't an aftermath. It's an ongoing weapon. Sexual violence in war is designed to destroy social fabric, to make survivors unmarriageable in conservative societies, to traumatize entire communities into displacement, to break the intergenerational transmission of identity. This is genocide by other means, and it requires international financing, weapons supply chains, and political cover. All of which exist. None of which are being seriously disrupted.
Pivot to Story 4, and watch the supply chain dominoes fall. The South China Morning Post reports BYD, China's EV champion, just raised the price of its D-Pilot 300 driver assistance system by 21%, citing sharp rise in global storage hardware costs. Memory chip inflation has officially jumped from phones to cars. This sounds like a tech story. It's actually a geopolitics story.
Memory chips, DRAM and NAND flash, are concentrated among a handful of producers, Samsung, SK Hynix, Micron, and a couple of Chinese players. The recent surge in pricing isn't just AI demand, though that's the cover story. It's also a direct consequence of U.S. export controls choking Chinese semiconductor independence, while simultaneously the AI bubble inflates demand at the high end. Ordinary consumers absorb the cost.
Here's what the financial press won't say plainly. The Biden and Trump-era CHIPS Acts and export controls were sold as national security measures. In practice, they've created artificial scarcity that benefits incumbent producers and punishes Chinese competition through price warfare. BYD's 21% hike is the consumer-facing receipt for Washington's industrial policy. The middle-class car buyer in Chengdu is paying for the Pentagon's Taiwan strategy.
And let's not pretend American consumers escape this. Ford, GM, and Tesla source memory through the same global market. Every infotainment system, every advanced driver assistance package, every connected car feature is going to get more expensive. The same playbook that crushed Huawei is now squeezing the entire automotive sector, and by extension, every working family that needs a car to commute.
Story 5 connects everything. The South China Morning Post has reported on the Zhongde 79, a medium-sized civilian cargo ship, spotted at Shanghai's Hudong-Zhonghua shipyard, that's been retrofitted to carry containerized vertical missile launchers, radar systems, and self-defense suites. Beijing has just operationalized the weaponized cargo ship doctrine, and the Taiwan Strait calculus has fundamentally changed.
This is the realization of a concept Chinese military strategists have written about for years, the civilian military fusion doctrine. By disguising missile platforms as ordinary container ships, China dramatically multiplies its launch capability while making targeting nightmarishly difficult. How do you preemptively strike a fleet when every cargo ship in the South China Sea might be a missile platform? You can't. That's the point.
But here's the deeper issue. The United States has spent 30 years projecting power through carrier strike groups, 11 supercarriers, each costing $13 billion, plus escorts, air wings, and supply chains. The Zhongde 79 likely costs under $50 million to convert. This is asymmetric warfare economics. A single hypersonic missile from a disguised container ship could potentially mission kill a $13 billion carrier. The math is brutal.
And it raises a question Washington's defense establishment refuses to answer publicly. If the Pentagon's own war games, leaked repeatedly to Defense News and Bloomberg, show the US losing simulated Taiwan conflicts, why are we still escalating? Who benefits from a war we're projected to lose? Defense contractors collecting trillions in budgetary allocations. That's who. The Lockheed Raytheon Northrop Axis profits from tension regardless of outcomes.
Connect the dots, viewers. Iran's currency dies to enforce dollar hegemony. Britain's colonial techniques live on in Palestinian occupation. Sudanese women are raped while UAE arms flow with Western blessing. Chinese consumers pay for American chip wars. Beijing weaponizes container ships against American carriers. These aren't 5 stories. They're 5 facets of a single global system in which civilians always lose, and elites always profit.
And the mainstream media's role in all of this is not neutral. It's structural. By covering each story in isolation, by refusing to name the actors, follow the money, or connect the patterns, corporate news functions as a depoliticizing engine. It teaches you to see chaos where there is design, accidents where there is intention, and inevitability where there is choice.
The pattern across all 5 stories is the privatization of profit and the socialization of suffering. Sanctions architects in Washington don't lose loved ones to insulin shortages. Westminster ministers who fund Israeli arms don't bury Palestinian children. UAE princes who finance the RSF don't get raped in Darfur. Pentagon planners gaming Taiwan scenarios don't crew the carriers. The decision-makers are insulated. The consequences are outsourced.
But here's what they fear, and it's why they invest billions in narrative control. They fear that you'll make these connections. They fear a public that recognizes Iranian sanctions, Palestinian occupation, Sudanese genocide, and Taiwanese brinkmanship as products of the same imperial logic. That's the moment the system loses its legitimacy, and once legitimacy goes, everything else follows.
So here's our call to action. First, diversify your news sources. Read Middle East Eye, South China Morning Post, Al Jazeera, and yes, even Russian and Chinese state media, not because they're truthful, but because triangulating between propaganda systems gets you closer to reality than trusting any one of them. Western media is also propaganda, it just hides the seams better.
Second, learn the names. Know who sits on the boards of Lockheed, Raytheon, BlackRock, Vanguard. Know which think tanks, the Atlantic Council, the Heritage Foundation, the Council on Foreign Relations, manufacture the consent for these wars. Power names itself if you bother to look. Anonymity is its first defense.
Third, support independent journalism financially. The reason corporate media won't tell you these stories isn't ignorance. It's incentive structure. They're funded by defense contractors, pharmaceutical giants, and oil majors through advertising. Independent outlets, funded by readers, have the structural freedom to follow the truth. Use that freedom by sustaining it.
Fourth, refuse the framing. When a politician calls a sanctions regime targeted, ask who's actually dying. When a general calls civilian casualties collateral damage, ask who's collateral. When a media outlet calls a war complicated, ask who profits from the complication. Language is the first battlefield, and you have agency on it every single day.
We're Truth Report. We don't tell you what to think. We tell you what they don't want you to think about. 5 stories tonight. 5 threads of a single global tapestry. Pull on any of them and the whole imperial loom unravels. That's why they keep you distracted. That's why we keep cutting through.
Stay awake. Stay angry. Stay together. Because the only thing more powerful than the system we just described is a public that finally sees it for what it is. Until next time, this has been Truth Report.